Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Transatlantic relationship as we know it are over, at least under the Trump auspices.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. Germany's political landscape is shifting as the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, led by Friedrich Merz, won in recent elections over Chancellor Olaf Scholz's left-leaning coalition. Meanwhile, the far-right Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, continues to rise in the polls, capitalizing on economic grievances, migration fears, and dissatisfaction with Berlin's leadership. Merz, a staunch fiscal conservative and advocate of transatlantic ties, has positioned himself as a defender of European security, calling for greater military spending and a more assertive German role in NATO. He supports continued aid to Ukraine, emphasizing the necessity of European rearmament in the face of Russian aggression. However, his balancing act between appealing to right-leaning voters and distancing himself from the AfD remains a critical challenge as Germany navigates its evolving security and political landscape, let alone the challenges posed by the Trump administration, where everything is transactional and America first, in which loyalty and friendship count for nothing. A year ago, we spoke to Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp. Karl-Heinz is an associate fellow of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and a lecturer at the University Roma Tre in Rome. And from Rome, Italy, we are pleased to have Karl-Heinz back on The Focus, where he'll give us his take on where Germany is heading. But just as an aside, Karl-Heinz and I are part of the Alphen Group network of security practitioners. The Alphen Group is ably led by Professor Julian Lindley-French. We are all supporters of Atlanticism as the continuing basis for European security, still swimming nobly against the tide. Karl-Heinz, welcome back to The Focus.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
Karl-Heinz, Scholz's Zeitenwende speech on the 27th of February 2022 promised a fundamental shift in German security policy, yet progress has been sluggish. Why did his government struggle to translate rhetoric into concrete action, especially in terms of military modernization and European defense initiatives?
Well, I think that the Zeitenwende speech of a few days after the starting of the war, the Zeitenwende took place in a number of areas. It's not only the 100 billion that was provided immediately, which certainly was not enough, but what we achieved in the meantime is, or after a while, which I never had believed, I was at that time in the German Ministry of Defense, was a fundamental change in the heads and minds of the people. So we still, over the entire time, we had support, majority support, despite our right-wing and left-wing extremists. We had majority support for supporting Ukraine, for keeping up sanctions against Russia, and for becoming the second largest supporter, also military supporter of Ukraine. And this is the hell of a lot for a country which was always blamed being pacifist, anti-nuclear, and what have you. What happened, though, is that, difficult to specify exactly, but in the last year, this entire, the speed of the Zeitenwende went down significantly. And this had mostly to do with the Chancellor. It laid in his personality. And of course, he had the trouble of having a coalition of three parties. Germany is a coalition country. Since more than 50 years, we never had a majority. One party in an absolute majority. So coalitions with two were normal for us. Coalitions with three are extremely difficult. So Zeitenwende, it was quite clear that the 100 billion could only be the first step, but the second step in hardware was missing. So we had the, let's call it, software change in the heads and minds of the people, but then it would be necessary to put more money on the table, and that's where the government fall apart about, because no one was against putting more money on the table, but the liberals said only by reprioritization of our budget, which means cutting the social part a little bit, and the others wanted more debt. And this was the dividing line when this entire thing blew up.
You know, the far right has gained ground partly due to public concerns over immigration. Has it also sort of ticked upwards because of general security concerns as well? I mean, and here I've got to try to make a bit of a separation between migration is a security concern, but it's not a hard security concern like war is. So is there a core in the AfD that says, you know what, we're really wanting to have a strong Germany across the board? Or is it we want to be strong against migrants and we don't really care about Russia?
I think it's a little bit more the latter. The problem also is, as with many parties who is a little bit like the Trumpies. You never fully understand what they are up to. They have a number of concerns or complaints. Migration is too much, but all these populists usually come into trouble when they make it from the opposition to a decision-making position where they have to find solutions, because it's one thing to lament and the other thing to have a solution. And the AfD, that's why we have the Berlin Wall back. We have a division in Germany between East and West, where the East, the former GDR, is basically AfD land, and the other part is the, let's call it, democratic land. Has to do with a number of things. I mean, entire books are written on this. Has to do with the fact that after the wall came down, many of the mobile ones moved from the east to the west. So those remaining felt the leftovers, rightly or wrongly. I think it's wrong, but it's a huge mixture. And the entire AfD thing is an off the guts party. We don't like these blacks running around and these Asians, and they are robbing our jobs. The really simple arguments, which never can be supported by any empirical data. And to make the absurdity more complete in the election program of the AfD was to cut very quickly the financial support for unemployed people.
Right.
The majority voters of the AfD are unemployed people.
Right.
So no one cares to read a party program. The problem of the AfD is, and that's actually the good news, it is not, the AfD is not willing or able to go into a coalition with anyone else. So as much vote she has, she will never have an absolute majority to form a government.
Yep.
And there is now a split in the AfD going on. Those who say we have to remain radical, maybe have to become even more radical to attract more people. The others say you have to become less radical, because otherwise you will never be accepted as a part of a coalition. Where this goes to, no one knows.
You know, that's really fascinating, because I see a similar pattern developing among MAGA supporters and the MAGA government. So Donald Trump has unleashed Elon Musk, who is slashing and burning his way with his metaphorical chainsaw to ensure that all government services are brought to a halt, including, what's that little thing called? Social welfare benefits for the poor. Most of the MAGA support base are from the poor. So if the AfD is going through a similar kind of phase, it seems that the right, and I mean, look, we can sit down here for, well, we'd certainly need to have some intoxicating beverage to continue this down this particular path. But you know, from a historical from a historical perspective, if you really wanted to take a leaf out of the old right wing, dare I say, Nazi party, they were the ones that went to they tried to lift up the people. Whether they succeeded or not, and how it all fell apart is another story. But the thing is that for the old fascist parties in Europe, they understood that there was a sort of quid pro quo loyalty among its base in a way the modern right simply doesn't do it. The modern right's happy to throw their support base immediately under a bus. They don't even give them time to sort of cogitate. It's like, oh, well, there goes your social welfare, son. Oh, you're starving? Pah, too bad. Go find a job in our new environment of no work.
Well, I think yes, there are many parallels to the MAGA movement because apparently, and we have only 6 or 7 weeks in the Trump administration time, which seems like 7 months or 7 years, but apparently the US or the Trump team is very good in shooting in its own foot,
Yeah.
and they are now developing even more capacities in doing so. With the AfD, it's slightly different because it's not in power. And the AfD has strong Nazi elements. It has indeed, but it's not a Nazi party. It is, as I said, it is this off the guts party,
Yeah.
which deals with the with the complaint of the people. For instance, entire woke movement,
Yep.
which in Germany is even more difficult because our language is a little bit complicated. We have these two different articles, male and female. And we, in the meantime, you are, for instance, student. Okay, student in Germany exists in male and female.
Yeah.
In the past, like in Italy, like in North other countries, we spoke about the male version by saying the students. Okay, now you have to say either. You have to specify the students male, students female, or you have to say those who are studying. And the people get nuts by saying, sorry, I mean, you are, it goes to, I grew up as a child with a certain chocolate, which has as the picture a little black boy from, at that time, Oriental, with a turban, black. Not allowed anymore because it's a minority. We are changing streets, the name of streets, because you discover that everyone, every general, whoever, after whom the street was named, had some dark spots in his past. And this is something that drives the people nuts. It's only one element. So this mixture of migration, my personal situation, interestingly enough, the personal, most Germans say my personal situation is quite good, but the country is going down the drain. Plus, as I said, migration, plus this entire, those basically the Trump element of the Washington deep state. We have a little bit like this, and this gives this AfD thing. As I said, the fundamental difference is that the MAGA people are governing, the AfD people are not.
Yeah, okay. Now that we're on this, and we will get back on track in a moment, but I just want to push this point a little further. If memory serves me correctly, now the media never made that much of a big deal about it. It was headline news initially, but a couple of years back, wasn't there some sort of, I wouldn't say deep state putsch, but some attempt at a putsch by a German aristocrat and a handful of other people. Now, I think the coup plotters had been arrested and thrown in the clink or something. But the fact of the matter is that you had this sort of thing happen. Were these people sympathetic to the AfD? Were they deep state operatives? I mean, we hear that there are German families that, got very rich during World War II and basically created these huge, conglomerates. They're still in charge. They're still getting very rich from the proceeds of their commercial dealings post-war. Is there a German deep state?
No, I mean, this was more an operette scene, as still it was a dangerous one. It was a number of people. There is a very small, very, very small group of people in Germany, and you have these maniacs everywhere who
Yeah.
is denying that Germany has been created as a state, but that instead, following the Second World War, the German Reich, before the Hitler Reich, never ended to exist. And they wanted to recreate the Reich.
Yep.
It was so bizarre. The problem is that, like many religious extremists, for instance, as crazy as they are just dangerous because they might kill other people. So this was detected early enough, and actually they had been sent to jail only a couple of weeks ago. But this is not a deep movement. These are one of these maniacs, and it was a small group. We are talking about, I don't know, 20. For instance, the European terrorism movement, which we had in the 70s, which was in Italy very strong, which was in Germany very strong, was much more dangerous, much stronger, much larger than
More
these,
organized.
more organized than the, by the way, supported by the then GDR and by the Soviet Union, with organization and financial. I mean, that was much more than these 12 people, I think, that have been arrested, which were just nuts, simply nuts.
Thank you for putting my mind at ease about that. All right. Now, when we're talking about Germany's security position, you raise the notion that after unification, the two halves of Germany never really came together in the way that people were expecting. I suppose there was always that, well, fear by some European states, but there was this expectation by some Germans that their folk would come together and you would have a very powerful Germany sitting in the middle of Europe, and there would be no cleavage between the old GDR and the Federal Republic. So, what is explaining the doubling down of East German sentiment against the nominally Western part of the country? Is there Russian interference happening, or is this just a domestic issue that the Germans themselves have just not been able to work out?
Well, I mean, I am not a sociologist, but there are libraries full of analyses why these two Germans never grew together. And in a minute, I talk about whether it's necessary or possible at all to grow together. Living in Italy, I have a completely different experience here. There was for many years and I still exists a little bit, this mutual prejudice from the Easterners to the arrogant Westerners, those who drove a Mercedes already when they didn't even know what a Mercedes was, and vice versa, the same prejudice or sentiment of the Westerners to the Easterners, the Aussies, as we call them, always lamenting. I mean, we built you nice streets. What the hell are you complaining about? We thought that this would be over in one generation,
Yep.
and apparently it takes more. And then, of course, to this basic split, let's call it split, although I think split is way too much. This basic difference, now all the things coming, yes, there is, the East is more a fertile ground for extremism, I was just saying. Now we even learn that extremism or that xenophobia was something which was very well spread in the former GDR, which we didn't know. Deep-rooted because all the Vietnamese were brought in, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, now Russian interference, certain developments help to keep this up. So, but let's make a break. I mean, how much harmony can you really expect in a country that stems of very different roots historically? We are not the United. I mean, we are a combination of federal states, former fairly independent regions, and it was never the United States element where everyone wanted to be American. Okay, it's a little bit more like in Italy, where the Sicilians are more Sicilians than they are Italians, and the North Italians are much more, I don't know, people from the Alps region or whatever. So let's take it as it is. I mean, my goodness, I grew as a child with a number of jokes between the Bavarians, Western Germany, the Bavarians in the south, and the ones in the very north, being described as completely stupid. A little bit like Joe Sixpack in Iowa. Yes, we should, and this is also something the new government is now working on by saying, look, I mean, we try to balance this by financial transfers. We had for many years a special envoy for the East in the government. And you can ask yourself, why the hell do we need a special envoy to the East? I mean, you don't have in the US government a special envoy for the Texans or for the, so, let's take it as it is. It's not something which is so unusual and that really paralyzes the country. No, not at all.
Okay, so I'm curious about how Merz sees the current issues happening across the Atlantic. Here in Australia, I think that there are a lot of people in denial that the last 7 weeks even happened. I think that there are too many true believers in Canberra and elsewhere in Australia that are so invested in the American alliance that they can't bring themselves to see that the world is changing before their eyes. And I mean, we always had a bit of a saying here in Australia that we're about 15 years behind everyone else. So everyone else will wake up and smell the coffee, but we're going to be the last ones to do so, by which stage we'll look out at the world and the world has changed completely. But that's just one of those things that we have to deal with. But it's interesting that after you've just described the kind of uncomfortable fractionalism within the German state, you then have not just the Russians to worry about, which has always been an issue for Germany and even the pre-German city-states and ecclesiastical areas, because Germany, before it unified in 1871, was basically a battleground of French interests, Russian interests, Austrian interests, and, but now you've got a guy in the name of Donald Trump sitting in Washington, D.C., declaring trade war all over the place, threatening your neighbor Denmark, wanting to take over Greenland, and also, NATO ally Canada. I mean, I don't know. I look at this and I think that everyone's bloody insane. How does Germany see this from an official perspective? Because it must complicate the security equation.
Well, actually, okay, I'm always an optimist. That's how I survived 4 years in the German Ministry of Defense. But I think it's the notion of change in Germany came very quickly, like in the famous Zeitenwende speech. It took a couple of days before the Ukraine war. We were ready to support Ukraine with 5,000 helmets. There was nothing more embarrassing than this offer. And then they switched completely. With Merz, the same happened. So we have the second Zeitenwende, maybe even more brutal. At the beginning of the Trump administration, or before the Trump administration, a new government, and it was pretty much in the cards that Merz would win the elections. The question was with whom he would go into a coalition. It was clear that there was a policy change necessary, announced, and it would have been implemented in 3 areas. First, reactivate the economy, which went down the drain significantly. Second, deal with migration in what form ever. And third, and a huge gap between these two, and then a gap, and then the third, do a little bit more on defense because, the Russian and you never know. So I think the 2 cold showers which came, and you could feel it in this country, was the speech of Vance at the Munich Security Conference.
Yep.
Where the key takeaway for us was that Vance says that the Trumpies and Hungary and the Polish extremist PiS party and the AfD, these are the real West.
Yeah.
And we others who believe in these strange things like the rule of law and equality and these bizarre concepts, we are out. And when then the second cold shower, which was even stronger, emphasizing this, when then Trump turned around the guilt question of saying actually Ukraine attacked Russia.
Yeah.
That was the moment which changed everything in Europe, because I come in a minute back to Germany. In the first Trump administration, when the same idiotic things happened, many European countries, particularly the Eastern Europeans, Poland, tried to establish bilateral relations with the Americans by well behavior. Defining or siding with Russia against Ukraine was the red line. For Poland, for the Baltics, for Germany, for France, for the UK. So there is now a moment of unity, and the agenda of the government, the planned agenda, changed within a week. Now it is defense, defense, defense. Merz is quoted with "whatever it takes." Whatever it takes is a quote from Draghi, who was the president at that time of the European Central Bank when we had the EU crisis. He said, before the euro goes down the drain, whatever it takes to save the euro. And Merz says, whatever it takes, we will have enough money to defend us and the Europeans. And then strengthening of economy and migration and so on. So the priority changed significantly, and all this happened in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And you have a broad support for this. We have a support in Germany for significantly raising defense budget. I couldn't believe my eyes. Still, it has been made a little bit more digestible by raising our debt significantly, which was not planned. The initial Merz plan was reprioritization of the budget. There were very concrete plans of cutting in the social element, and it was no one likes this, but we realized in Europe stands not the EU. Europe stands for 9.3% of world population, right? The same Europe spends almost 60% of world social expenditure. So there must be some fat, some grease, some meat to cut. So, but this is now turned around. We will increase our debt significantly because it is this whatever it takes moment. And this happened fairly quickly, and it happened in France and happened in the UK. I don't think that Trump expected so much unity. The same happened on the EU level now. You see a huge amount of things happening, spending more on defense. And then we can discuss for hours whether this goes quick enough, whether we have to buy also American weapons, or we should better buy it in South Korea. These are the side effects. But the fundamental thing is, and this is something that hurted us all, also me, also you, we cannot rely on the US anymore. Transatlantic relationship as we know it are over, at least under the Trump auspices. And this was a shock, but it has been implemented. It has arrived in the heads and minds, even of those like me, staunch Atlanticists.
So, okay, you raise an interesting point, Karl-Heinz, and that is a point that we suffer from here in Australia, and that is most of our weapons come from the United States. Most of the high-tech business end of things, if you will, for Europe, except for France, maybe Sweden, comes from the United States. People are still being strong-armed into buying JSF fighters and various other bits and pieces. There's obviously going to be a problem here. I mean, some people in the media have been talking about kill switches, where now that things are all over the place and, Lockheed Martin may just not be able to provide the next update for your JSF fighters. So where does that leave the Air Force, for instance? Certainly not in a good place. And not all European countries have got defense industry depth to the point where they could do some local enhancements of American products to make them more localized and less dependent on the United States. Do you think that Germany should start leading in terms of relying more upon what Rheinmetall can be doing, maybe even stretching out as far as across the Baltic to find out what the Swedes are doing with their Air Force technology? Or even, as you rightly pointed out, going to South Korea and seeing what they have to offer, as opposed to maintaining the force structures of Europe in their current form.
Let me start with a kill argument, which was often heard before. Whenever the money came, the 100 billion, or now the money, people are saying, well, we do not have the defense industry here in Europe to be able to deliver all the goods quickly enough. Then before the Trump term, it was the solution to buy in the US, which was also already a change in German thinking, in European thinking, because the previous idea always was, let's do it European. It costs twice as much, but it creates this EU thing. France was strongly pushing for this. And then when our defense minister Pistorius came, he said that after the beginning of the war, he said one element of procurement is time. Where I get the product quickly enough, I buy it off the shelf. Now, as you are saying, we are concerned whether or not we will get the next updates or kill switches. I think this entire discussion of we Europeans cannot do it, or we cannot do without the US. If it has to go without the US, it has to go without the US, and it will go without the US. Politics is something where you cannot say, oh, doesn't go, so we don't do it. So you then have to find ways, and I think, I mean, there are producers around a lot. Turkey is producing excellent drones. South Korea is producing the hell of a lot of. They're huge. The Northern Europeans, Sweden has an excellent defense industry, so there is a lot. Whether they can produce enough, I don't know. I'm not an expert on these issues. So it will go one way or the others. By the way, we should not forget that the US defense industry wants to sell. And
yes,
the very moment when they do not deliver upgrades anymore, this sends terrible signals to all other countries, to all their clients. And I'm not sure whether the industry is willing to follow any orders of Trump in that direction when they ruin their own companies. Fast forward, does all this need German leadership in European defense? First, I'm always skeptical with the term German leadership, or the leadership in general, because many European, let's talk about the before Trump term. In this discussion, we always have the before Trump and the after Trump time. Whenever the Europeans, the Baltics and the Eastern Europeans and whoever, we need German leadership. Yes, you like leadership as long as you are led in the direction you want to go anyway. You hate leadership, regardless by whom, if it brings you in a direction you don't want to go. So that's why I'm always careful with regard to leadership. And we have seen, particularly Germany, whenever Germany took leadership in the Euro crisis in 2008, which had terrible sacrifices in Greece, in Italy and elsewhere, you saw the pictures of Angela Merkel with the Hitler mustache.
Yeah, I remember.
So this is the leadership. No, but I think defense industry or industry in general does not need leadership. They need predictable contracts.
Yes.
They need to see that there is money to be spent. They are not developing issues without knowing that we can sell it later on, and we can also export it. Germany was blocking for years and decades the export of common European products because of our anti-export policy. All this is gone. Right. All this is gone. So And we saw that, for instance, Rheinmetall has increased. Germany does not have pure defense industry companies. They're always mixtures, like for instance Airbus, or like for instance Rheinmetall. What we see is that they are now changing their civil elements to military production. They built military production lines in their previously civil parts. Is this quick enough? I don't know, but it's fairly quick, and it's 10 times quicker than it has been. So the question never can be, oh, we will not make it anyway, as many people are saying. It will take the Europeans to take 10 years until they can replace the US major support systems. I don't know why it takes that long, but the solution cannot be, okay, let's not even try it because 10 years is too long. We are doing it. And the change that happened in the last years, Ukraine does not have hardware problems anymore right now. They have a manpower problem significantly. 45% of the weapons used in the Ukraine war are produced by the Ukrainians. By the way, they also would like to sell their weapons products if we would buy them. 30% comes from the Europeans and 30% comes from the US. So just to say that things that seemed to be unsurmountable 3 years ago now have to come to a bearable situation. Will this go with everything? I don't know, but I see an awareness and people working on it step by step, also in Germany.
You know, there's been a lot said about, Russia, the depth of its strategic industry or defense industries, what they can bring to the table, and that's what makes it so very difficult for analysts looking at Europe without the United States, and they, basically hold their hands up and go, oh my God, Europe is going to fall to pieces. But what you're basically suggesting is it won't be that bad because the Europeans are moving pretty fast in order to adapt to new circumstances. So my question to you is, if that's the case, will Europe adapt faster than Russia? And will that be then its guarantee to prevent Russia from trying it on? Say, for instance, Trump does manage to, secure a ceasefire deal of some description. Can we be assured that Europe will be strong enough, even if Trump decides to withdraw all American forces from Europe, break NATO completely, that Europe will be able to stand up for itself against Russia?
Let me make 2 or 3 points. First, let's see the entire business from Putin's point of view, except that he now politically believes he has an ally. But if he sees the situation on the battleground, okay, we have, so first the question of, is Europe I make one jump back, sorry. Is Europe able to defend itself? We have 400 million Europeans who need to defend themselves against 150,000 Russians, which did not manage to overcome in 11 years 50 million Ukrainians. It doesn't seem completely impossible. Point 2, now to my Putin's point of view. If I would be Putin, I wouldn't sleep that well. I lost 700,000 people on the battlefield. The toll is rising every day. I burned my entire modern weaponry, physically burned them. I am due to sanctions. Yes, they could be stronger and they managed to circumvent partly, but at the end it costs a lot of money. I'm not able to refurbish all these things quickly enough to replenish all my stocks. There are analyses who are saying the Russians are producing 1,500 tanks a month. No, they are modernizing old T-54 and T-55, which still remain a T-55. I mean, an old Volkswagen modernized is an old Volkswagen. It is never Tesla. Okay, Tesla is not a good.
No, not in this environment. No.
So, just to say that, let me tell you one one little anecdote, because it's a political question. When you say Russia is ready to be ante portas, before our doors in 3 years, you speed up political processes much more, as if you say, actually, the Russians will not be able to reconstitute their power long enough. So it's also a political deal. When I was in the Ministry of Defense, there came a study and a paper out in Germany saying that, I think it was in 3 years, Russia would be ready to attack Poland in 3 years. Our Russia people in the ministry said this is completely ridiculous. I mean, where do they have the data from? At that very moment, our defense minister Pistorius had created the term Kriegstüchtigkeit. Germany has to be ready to war, ready to go to war, which was an outcry anyway, because the term war in Germany was already difficult. But he made this point, we have to be war ready in. And the minister said, look, hey, this paper is great because it fits in my ready to war thing. So you also include the political element in this business. And of course, the closer you are to the Russian border, the more concerned and the more alarmist your assessments are. Portugal probably cares not that much about this entire thing. So just to say, of course, Russia is a huge country. It has nuclear weapons. It has still a huge weaponry. But I don't see their capacities to run over Poland so quickly. And the second question is why? Why should they? I understand Ukraine is a post-Soviet conflict. Putin, he has stated it X times, he wants to reestablish the Soviet Empire. Yes, he would like to have Ukraine, maybe the Baltics, maybe a little bit, but it is not that he has any global empire, Roman Empire idea of, now running over entire Europe as the Soviet, as we believe the Soviet Union would do. I don't know, so I can be wrong, but still, I don't see this depleted army, which has problems to seize 15 kilometers in the Donbass. I mean, keep in mind that Russia managed in the last 11 years, since 2014, to occupy 21% of Ukrainian territory. And among us, the shittiest part of Ukrainian territory. This is not a huge success. So if I would be Putin, I would not congratulate my military to this. Just to say the Russians are not 6 feet tall and they don't get 6 feet tall. Can we relax? No, we cannot. That's why all the steps are correct. But if you see the Russian reaction to this EU promise to rearm, to the German promise to rearm, it was alarmist. They didn't like to see this at all.
Our last guest on the show was Dr. Roy Casagrande, who made a very bold prediction that Germany will rearm, and when the process is finally complete, it'll have the third largest military in the world. I mean, I challenged him on that, suggesting that the German people have long exercised the ghosts of Prussian militarism, are still apologizing, at least formally, for their role in World War II, and that Germany's demography and industry are rapidly declining. Where do you stand on all of this?
Well, I mean, this was an argument which was often used in 10, 15 years ago when we Germans always promised to fulfill the 2% demand of NATO, but we never even seriously tried. And one of the excuses was, we better don't do it because our allies in France or in Poland might be terribly concerned if this Germany now becomes such a strong European military power. And it was the then Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski who said, I am more afraid of a weak Germany than I would be afraid of a strong Germany. So I think any historical remnants, at least in the conventional field, do not exist anymore for very good reasons. I mean, there is no one in Germany who wants to go to any Prussian imperialism, definitely not. Certainly not in the West and definitely not in the East. This is it's actually more a problem of whether we are really willing to rearm our armed forces, have a huge manpower problem, because the people are not running to the arms cheerfully. So I don't see this happening. It has one, let me open a little sideline, since we are discussing in these days, what happens if Donald Trump unfolds the nuclear umbrella over Europe. And then we have all the discussions, maybe the French and the Brits and nuclear cooperation, God knows what. One element you never heard, except of one or two eccentric academics, and I think one extreme right politician, was that Germany should get nuclear weapons. There is no one in the German political spectrum, there never was since the 1960s, and there is no one seriously or serious person proposing this, because this, I think, leaving alone that it doesn't make sense, leaving alone that we don't have to, leaving alone that it would cost billions, trillions, and quadrillions. But this is maybe the element which could stir up concerns. It is, by the way, it's a scenario which is so bizarre. It's so far away, but this is maybe an element that could create some concerns on a new German imperialism. But since this is not going to happen, at least not in my lifetime, and I intend to stay a little bit around, no, all the rest, I don't see this. And whether we become I mean, for the time being, I think the second largest, if not the strongest army in Europe is Ukraine. So where we Germans are, I honestly don't know. And we have reduced our military. We have ignored it for so many years. And that's one of the mistakes, maybe the faults of the Merkel time. Also, from her point of view, it was not a fault. Because with this, you win elections, okay? If you don't spend on the military, if you spend a lot on social wealth, if you buy cheap gas from Russia, you win elections. That's a convenient life. But I don't see us moving to the top of any European military. Be happy if we manage to get our Bundeswehr functioning. This would already be a huge success.
Oh, wow. Okay, don't set your sights too high there, Karl-Heinz. But okay, look, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and really the Bundeswehr has been, pushed into the dirt, shall we say, in terms of not having enough manpower, not having enough weapons. It really has to go through some major reform, which in itself is going to cost a lot of time. Just going back to the idea of where the German people sit on all of this. Now, security is usually an elite sentiment. You know, there are those people who like soldiers and weapons and sailors and airmen and all that kind of thing, and bombs and rockets, but they're usually divorced from society. They're out there in the defense ministries, plotting and weaving and doing whatever they have to do. But what about the German people in terms of how they see themselves as a people, as a power? Say, for instance, I'll give you a hypothetical. If a Trump-imposed peace on Ukraine would come about, would the German people be worried? Or would they celebrate getting back to business as usual so they can have high social welfare expenditure again and not worry about the military? Where do you think the German people would find themselves in that hypothetical scenario?
When in February 22, Chancellor Scholz made the Zeitenwende speech, I said, okay, nice try. We get 100 billion, not bad, but this is it. It will not cause this fundamental societal change. And it did. And I mentioned before, the pacifist anti-weapons export country become the second largest weapons exporter to Ukraine. We had this tremendous welcoming to Ukrainian refugees. As I said, until now, despite AfD, a majority for keeping up sanctions to Russia, supporting Ukraine, now even a majority for raising defense budgets. So it has been a tremendous societal change. And I was asking myself, why is this the case? Because you are rightly saying, usually people care about health insurance and their pension and not about defense. I think it has a lot to do with proximity. It is not Afghanistan, which is somewhere, God knows where, but the distance from Kiel in the north of Germany to Munich in the south of Germany is the same distance than from Berlin to Ukraine. Which means there is the feeling not that we don't sleep at night because we think Putin is standing at the Brandenburg Gate soon, but is a proximity.
Yeah.
Okay, you could almost hear the raw thunder of the war, and that makes a difference. And then this strong feeling of injustice. Afghanistan, completely different ball game, trying to build it up, and Taliban sometimes successful, sometimes not. But here, a country, a difficult country. I mean, Ukraine was a difficult country before the war. It was an oligarch society, highly corrupt. But at the end, the country that tried to become democratic with more or less success, and this has been attacked with all announcement ahead. I mean, Putin said it a couple of times, I will attack Ukraine. We said, no, he will not. We had a huge discussion in the German Ministry of Defense where the military people were saying he will attack because he does all the preparations. And we civilians said, no, come on. I mean, his damage will be much bigger than, and so on. So he did it. This led to a fundamental change, and then this very much unity in Europe, except let's say Hungary. So there has been a fundamental change, and this is something, by the way, which one has to compliment the previous government for the threefold coalition of the Greens, the Liberals, and the Conservatives. They exercised leadership, once again, is a difficult term, but the Greens, for instance, changed most. Okay, we have the Greens who have been created in the late 70s and 80s as an anti-military, an anti-nuclear, an anti-NATO party, was the strongest supporter of Ukraine. We had an election campaign until 2 weeks ago. Usually in election campaigns, you try to be nice, you always promise nice things. There was one party in Germany who called for 3.5% of our GDP for defense. Which party was it? The Greens. I couldn't believe my eyes. We have one Green politician, Anton Hofreiter. We call him Tank Tony because he knows tank types better than you and I. So just to say, fundamental change in the government, which really, and that was a little bit like leadership, whether it was leadership from behind or from the top, I don't know, but it really created this fundamental change in our perception with regard to security and defense.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Rome, Italy, we are speaking with Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp, Associate Fellow of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and lecturer at the University Tre in Rome. Look, Karl-Heinz, let's get back to nuclear matters. You raised it earlier. We're going to have to drill a bit deeper now. Okay, so given Germany's historical aversion to nuclear weapons and its commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, how realistic is it for the French to put nuclear weapons on German soil as part of a broader European deterrence strategy? I mean, from what you're saying, Germany's undergoing so many changes in terms of its strategic thinking that this can't be, an outlandish idea anymore. It could have been, say, 12 months ago, but not now.
Okay, you step three steps ahead, so to speak, of the question. First, I don't think, I can be wrong, but I don't think that it is not that likely that the US will really close the nuclear umbrella over Europe, because there are a number of factors which maybe Donald Trump might not be aware of, but his entourage, maybe not even his close entourage, but the security establishment in the US well knows. First, the US umbrella, nuclear umbrella over allies, is always a means of non-proliferation, of preventing other countries to go nuclear.
Yeah.
And I don't know how Poland will react, how Turkey will react. I don't know how South Korea will react if the umbrella gets closed. If it gets closed over Europe, it would be a European problem, but not only, because also the countries and democracies in Asia Pacific, in your region, might ask themselves, how reliable are the Americans also for us if they just closed the umbrella over the Europeans? And then we are talking about a huge amount of things. I mean, there is a strong nuclear consensus in the US between Democrats and Republicans that nuclear deterrence has to be kept up, not only against China, but also against Russia, because if the US is not able to deter China and Russia anymore, it loses its superpower status. So all this might be too complicated for Donald Trump, but I still think that is, let's assume worst case. Tomorrow he says, I give a damn. By the way, how do you close a nuclear umbrella? Nuclear deterrence is there. It is not like military personnel you withdraw. The question is, you should explicitly state, I will not defend these goddamn Germans or Europeans. Still, Vladimir Putin could not be sure that Donald Trump basically changes his mind overnight and says, I bombed the hell out of them. So nuclear deterrence is something which is difficult to withdraw, unlike military force. But once again, let's assume worst case it happens. What can Europe do? First, as I said, to go nuclear, Germany is not an option. Any EU, there was always the idea that the EU could have a nuclear force, as we have a common currency. Why not a common nuclear force? This is ridiculous because we don't have a common government.
That's right.
And since we do not have a common president who can decide on nuclear weapons, you cannot decide on nuclear weapons in a 5 hours night session in Brussels. This doesn't go. So, no. But we have two nuclear powers in Europe, France and the UK, which are Western, so on our side, so in the European part of NATO, who have significant capacities, who always were regarded in NATO as strengthening deterrence because they confront any attacker with two independent decision-making centers. In the old days, we had the US decision-making centers and the two independent ones, which means a Putin must not only include in his cost-benefit analysis what Trump or the US would do, but also what the French and the Brits would do. And deterrence takes place in the mind or in the head of the attacker. Yeah. Can he be sure that the French will not use their nuclear weapons if he runs over Poland? Or that the UK uses a nuclear weapon if he attacks the Baltics? If he miscalculates, the damage for Russia is incredible. Do we know what he will do at the end? No, we don't. And I don't want to find out, honestly. But just to tell, there is a capacity which is there. We have one problem, and this is where you were just saying France. France, in the recent 40, 50, 60 years, rejected the idea of extended deterrence. The idea that a nuclear power can extend its umbrella over a non-nuclear country. And this is a difficult issue. You have an extended deterrence guarantee over Australia. It's always a credibility issue. Can you really be sure that the US will launch a nuclear weapon against China if, let's say, one of your countries will be attacked, if Melbourne gets attacked? So will the Americans sacrifice San Francisco in a counter strike to save Melbourne? You don't know, and you don't want to find out either. But that's the key credibility problem, which you cannot dissolve. And the French always said, we don't believe this. That's why we need our national nuclear weapons, because it only goes in the nation, which is not a stupid idea, by the way. Whether now Macron is changing this, there are some elements, but I don't know yet. Maybe this pillar of French nuclear thinking, which always was la nucléaire ne se partage pas. You cannot divide the nuclear. Maybe this is changing, maybe not. But what we can do now is we can closely cooperate between French and British nuclear weapon centers, which they are already doing, exchanging information. How are you working with this? Doing research together, and then include the non-nuclear allies in such a nuclear dialogue, like we have in the nuclear planning group in NATO. There is a paper coming out from the DGAP, the institution where I'm working for, in 2 days actually, explaining all this to signal to any attacker, yes, it would be better with the US, no doubt, we would prefer, but if not, we are not without deterrence, nuclear deterrence, and we send a signal of unity to you, we might even become serious on this. And since you don't want to find out and we don't want to find out, you better stay where you are, which is the key message of deterrence.
Oh, okay. Well, that's reassuring in a strange kind of way. But look,
sorry for such a lecture, but that's just my hobby horse. So whenever you punch something, then this entire thing explodes.
No, I'll keep punching then, because what I really want to find out now is the German reaction to the way that Zelensky was treated at the White House at the infamous Oval Office situation. I mean, how did that play among the German public? Did they shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's Donald Trump for you? Or did they get angry? Did they feel that they were being moved more toward the AfD? I mean, how did it work out in the public domain?
It was exactly, I spoke about these cold showers. We had the cold shower of Trump saying that actually that Ukraine is the guilty one, the cold shower of the Van speech in Munich saying actually we are the real West, you with your bizarre ideas of, obeying the law, give me a break, what a crazy idea. And the treatment of Zelensky in the Oval Office was another cold shower. And there was the feeling in the German press to say it was good that he did not fall on his knees. It was good that he came in uniform. By the way, Churchill also came in uniform in
know.
1944, I think, whenever it was.
Yeah.
And he was terribly mistreated. And Merz has been quoted by saying this was a prearranged trap.
Yes.
They wanted to show, no one knows, but it looks like. So this contributed to the image. Sorry, guys, sorry for our old ideas of transatlantic relations, but it's over, at least in that form. And that was a fairly unified reaction in Germany. I would even say in Europe in general, except once again Hungary, which is a bizarre country, or which has a bizarre government, let me put it that way. But there was a very unique, and the way how warmly Zelensky was treated when he came to Europe in Brussels, he was hugging with von der Leyen, he was standing with all the heads of states together as one of them.
Yes.
Macron, Starmer shows very clearly, no, that was the wrong signal. That was a major mistake. As I said, the Trump administration is good in shooting in his own foot.
Indeed. So with regard to the so-called potential ceasefire agreement, what's your take on the colonial-style minerals arrangement? And do you think now that Trump has pushed his will onto Ukraine, Is the ball truly in Vladimir Putin's court? The one thing I found really odd about this whole situation is, and mind you, I think there's a natural explanation for this. Trump is the kind of individual that will suck the oxygen out of any room anywhere in the world. But we have not heard much from Vladimir Putin. Now, it could very well be that the European press cycle will probably report more about these things than the Australian press cycle. We only get the really, really big headlines over here. So maybe there's a nuance that I'm missing. But I find it very curious indeed that Vladimir Putin is almost nowhere. Well, where is he? And why isn't he coming up with anything, you think?
I think these are two different things: the raw material business and the Russian reaction to a ceasefire deal. The raw material thing, when Trump treated Zelensky as he did in the White House, many in Germany were saying it was a mistake because actually Trump has to come back and not so much Zelensky. Why? Yeah. Trump wants a deal, a peace deal, ceasefire with the Russians because he promised it. He promised it to his MAGA people in 24 hours. He might say, okay, 24 hours was a little bit too quick, but not in 5 years. So he needs desperately something to show off to his MAGA people, look what I did. And second, he desperately, it was the US who wanted this raw material deal to also, once again, to show to his people, I make Ukraine pay for our support. The raw material deal is not a raw material deal. There are not that many raw materials in Ukraine. Those which are there still have to be mined, so they're deep in the soil. There is not much money to make with. So for the Ukrainians, it was easy to sign this deal because they didn't lose anything. So that's one thing. The other thing, now we have talks. We have talks in Saudi Arabia, and there is apparently now the US envoys are on the way to Moscow. Now it gets difficult for Russia. And there was a newspaper article in Germany I think yesterday, showing all the reactions of the military bloggers in Russia. There is no comment still from the Kremlin. Putin, for the first time since ages, went to the front yesterday to the Kursk region, this region which has been occupied by the Ukrainians. So there is no official statement from the Kremlin, and all the military bloggers say, my goodness, what a bad deal for us, because these, let's say, 30 days of ceasefire give Ukraine the possibility to rearm, to rearrange, to reorganize. We don't want this. And then now the second part of the Trump element, because Trump always, this is why it's so difficult to predict, he also threatened Putin.
Yes, he did.
If you are not following any deal, I will squeeze you as much as I can. And he tries to do it with oil production, which will not work either. So I have no idea how this thing is going out. But now, indeed, the ball is in Russian's court, because Ukraine says, okay, ceasefire, fine with us. We Europeans say, if you manage to make a ceasefire, fine with us. The Americans say, ceasefire, yes. So if Russia says no, I would like to hear the excuse. The Kremlin finds not to enter in ceasefire mode without annoying Putin, without annoying Trump, because once again, he doesn't get his deal in 24 hours. And since he is the big deal maker and wants to present this, to prove this to his people, after this, the ball is in the court of the US again. So we Europeans are actually watching this ping pong and say, okay, let's see what's coming out. Interesting times.
Really interesting times. So assume for the moment, let's be hypothetical here. Let's assume for the moment that Trump manages to get a ceasefire. And let's assume for the moment that Vladimir Putin must be thinking to himself, I don't know what the hell's going on, but I'm steadily losing control of the situation. And he then decides to make a deal with Trump. And then the war comes to a halt for however long it comes to a halt for, beyond the 30 days of a ceasefire. Obviously, that is a very long battle line that one has to make sure does not get transgressed either from one side or the other. There is certainly an argument for peacekeepers to be put on the ground. But of course, those peacekeepers are going to be vulnerable to, well, dare I say, aggressive acts from both sides. Let's be fair here. But obviously, I think that we can really say that there is a chance that Russia will try to exploit that, break up the peacekeepers, and cause all sorts of merry hell down the track. Do you think that the Europeans really have a plan for enforcing the peace along the Ukrainian-Russian border as it's currently configured?
Once again, let's go one step back or one step ahead of this question. If we have a ceasefire tomorrow, which might even be extended to whatever term, me being Putin would not be happy at all, because I would ask myself, okay, I started a war, an all-out war, more than 3 years ago. I lost 700,000 people. I ruined my industry. I ruined the future of my country. I have only a few friends, which is China, which is North Korea, maybe the US in future, maybe. And I gained, as I said, 21% of Ukrainian territory. I got Crimea, which I already had since 2014. So was it worth it? And even the Russians, even if they don't have any tradition in stepping up to their government, but even they might ask, was it worth it? So did we really win, given our initial war goal was to remove the fascist government in Kiev and to make Ukraine a pro-Russian state? This Rest Ukraine has got something which it would have never got before, namely a serious perspective for EU. There is still a NATO perspective. US might block, Hungary might block, maybe, but it is there. This is not something which Donald Trump can take off the table. Sorry, Donald Trump can say, we will always block, or my government will always block a NATO membership like any other NATO government can block, but he cannot say we will prevent, or Ukraine will not come into NATO. So Ukraine got a lot. This is a little bit a cynical argument, I know, because you would tell to Ukrainians, you have to live with your losses, your geographical loss, and also you lost hundreds and thousands of your people. But anyway, I think in a net benefit for someone coming from the moon, you would say, actually, Ukraine won more than Russia has won.
Yeah.
So first point. Second point, any kind of security guarantees. If you ask military people, if you ask Ben Hodges, who knows the hell of a lot about this, he says, we are not talking about a UN peacekeeping mission where you have some blue helmets staying around and preventing. You have to force, or you have to prevent Russia with still a formidable or with a significant military force to attack Ukraine again, and this would require 200,000 soldiers plus all the military means plus air defense and so on. Do we have this? Probably not. Are some Europeans willing to send some forces? Yes, they have expressed, some countries, but certainly not to such an event. The question is, and then the question is, how much do you need? What will the deal will be? The US is saying, well, this would be the job of the Europeans to do this. Yes, but what if Russians run over the Europeans? Then this entire nice peace deal, which the genius Trump has struck, is basically out again. It is destroyed again. So the big deal maker did not succeed in the long run. So I don't know what will happen, but certainly the conservative thinking of strengthening Ukraine. By the way, Ukraine in the meantime has a strong military force by itself. I mean, I would leave it to the military to calculate how much you need. I think it would be much more important to have security guarantees. For instance, if we are talking about any European nuclear commitment for the European pillar of NATO, if then say, I go forward, if then France and the UK would say, yes, we also include Ukraine in such a security guarantee. It's not a guarantee because it is never a guarantee, but a statement like the security of Ukraine is vital for our security interests. Or like Chancellor Merkel said with regard to Israel, the security and safety of Israel is the raison d'être of Germany. Doesn't mean that we are sending forces there, but it's a very strong statement. Something like this is something which you could, and then the question is, would the Ukrainians satisfied with this, and would be Putin deterred by this, which we don't know. But certainly this idea of having a fully fighting 200,000 men European force with air defense and refueling and manpower and God knows what you need is not going to happen. You still could deploy small amounts of European forces on Ukrainian territory, as we did in the Cold War with the inner German border, where we had all kind of nations. We had the Belgians, the French, the British, the Dutch, all in the layer cake format at the inner German border, which means if the Soviet Union would have attacked, not only Germans would have died, but also Americans and British and French. And this is a strong reason to enter into a conflict. So there are all kind of mechanisms and ideas possible, but I would like to wait for any kind of ceasefire first, which I don't see yet, and then we can discuss about further steps.
Yeah, look, I hate always leaping into the unknown here, but the thought did cross my mind while I was listening to you speak. It won't ever happen, but what an incredible opportunity for the French to step up here. They could put some, I don't know, tactical nuclear weapons as a nuclear backstop to a European peacekeeping force. That means that the Europeans don't have to go in there with 200,000. They can go in there with whatever they can possibly afford. But then the Russians face the real prospect that if they cross over, there is hell to pay on the other side. It also brings us a lot closer to the idea of a nuclear war, assuming that Putin wants to go down there. But again, we're talking mental games here. You know, when we talk nuclear weapons, they're not weapons like, an AK-47. You know, it's something different. It is something that you're trying to outpsych your opponent with. The idea of actually deploying, say, 3 or 4 nuclear-capable Rafales in and around Lviv, just as a backstop, would probably send a very powerful signal. It would be relatively cheap to accomplish, and Putin would have to probably think very deeply about what he would want to do next.
Yeah, I mean, we have, once again, we have this pre-Trump and after-Trump discussion. In the pre-Trump discussion, I would have excluded a number of these issues. I would have excluded France ever throwing overboard this key column of French nuclear doctrine. We will never do this because it doesn't make any sense. And as I said, the French thinking is not stupid in that regard. I would have never expected that Germany now says whatever it takes for defense. Okay, I mean, we didn't care for defense for ages. I would have never expected the EU doing so much. So in the meantime, things are imaginable, which I would have never imagined before. However, you could do it in a much more gradual way. I mean, before you, and we do this with the NATO nuclear umbrella as well, before you really deploy nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil, which is a cost issue and thousands of things, to send a for instance, the Poles were offering that their nuclear fighter jets, that their fighter jets, they have the F-35, could be certified for nuclear weapons, which means in case of a war, they could also carry nuclear weapons as a backup for European ones. We don't want a nuclear war, but all this sends signals. Nuclear messaging is the key term. To an opponent, we are fairly serious in this. And then you could even think of building shelters in Poland. The Poles were even ready to pay for this. So there were these ideas already in NATO. So you could do the same thing with regard to Ukraine by saying, even if you don't go to Ukraine directly, but you have regular visits of Rafale nuclear-capable fighter airplane from France to Poland, sends a signal. To send a nuclear submarine to a Polish harbor, not sure whether they make it through the Baltic, but maybe, is a signal. So you could all, and then the next step could indeed be a visit of a nuclear submarine, a British or French nuclear submarine in a Ukraine port. So there are all kind. So before really deploying nuclear weapons there are a number of measures you can do, and then there's also a fundamental question, and a lot in nuclear deterrence is nuclear theology. You can believe it or not. Does the US security guarantee get more credible since we have US nuclear weapons on German soil? Yes or no? You have a nuclear umbrella over Australia, you have one over Japan, you have one over South Korea, and there are no nuclear weapons there. So you can also say what counts much more is the commitment of the nuclear weapon state, given in words and in all kinds of signals. So, as I said, there is a huge amount of signals, messages, means, options to do this, to convey to Russia, don't touch us and don't touch Ukraine and don't touch Georgia or Moldova or whomever we include in the thing. There, in the meantime, fantasy is free. And this is with all, and I don't say that I like what's happening in the US, and I would have loved to have this old transatlantic link functioning, but a number of things are happening now which would not have happened without this disruption. So, as the Chinese say, in any crisis, there's always a chance. So, and for the first time, the Europeans are using this, strange enough.
That is excellent. Although there is one elephant in the room that we haven't really quite unpacked, we touched on it earlier, and that is that the European Union as an entity, you're quite right, it doesn't have an executive president, it doesn't have a foreign policy, it doesn't have a defense policy, so it can't act as a country would act. But there's also a big split among European nations in terms of where their chief security priorities lie. Now, if I were to go anywhere south of the Alps, I think that I would imagine most countries would be very, I don't know, concerned about illegal immigration coming up from Africa, coming up from the Middle East. And for them, their security priorities would always be to try to stop that, not necessarily to help out in a shooting war with Russia, even if Russia is looking pretty dire and looks like it's going to go elsewhere. They just don't want to have a bar of that, because they think in their minds it's, our security is all about our cultural identity. It's all about other things that are very deep and very abiding to them. So how does Germany then play a bridging role, or can it play a bridging role between these two competing security paradigms in Europe? Or is Germany itself too divided on the issue to lead a coherent European response?
Well, first, this problem you are describing rightly, that different countries have different security priorities, which also have to do with their geographical location, is something you have everywhere. You have this also in NATO. We had a huge East-South debate in NATO in the last 10 to 15 years, where the Easterners, Poland, were always saying we need all the NATO money for the Eastern flank because never trust the Russians. Whereas the Italians, the Spanish, the Portuguese were saying, sorry, guys, I mean, our security concerns are on the southern side of the Mediterranean. So completely different. This is something you always have. And this is something we also had in the Cold War, because NATO Article 5 doesn't commit anyone to anything. NATO Article 5 says that if one country gets attacked, every other NATO member takes, I quote, the measures it deems necessary, which means a telegram of condolence would be theoretically enough. However, what we did in NATO, we made this very loose commitment waterproof by putting forces on other countries, by putting forces in Germany, by having all the troops there, so that if Germany gets attacked, other countries are attacked as well. We do not have the Cold War situation anymore, where we had this huge Soviet Union, where it was clear if Soviet Union attacks Turkey, Norway would be the next. So this is not the case, but this is something we are living with since the end of the Cold War. And this is not only in the EU, this is also in NATO. Still, the EU has become a very sufficient and efficient security policy actor since the beginning of the war. Not a military actor, but security policy actor in executing sanctions to Russia, painful ones, which hurt us as well. So it's difficult. In striking the grain deal to make sure that Ukrainians can export grain, making sure that all European countries have enough energy if the Russians stop the supply, sending a huge amount of money, military goods and civilian goods, to Ukraine. So there has been unity. Yes, there are countries who are always difficult. Slovakia is one, certainly Hungary, but we managed to circumvent them, sometimes to ignore them, sometimes to punish them. Is this nice? No, this is terribly painful. It takes ages and weeks and cumbersome, but this is how it goes. So once again, having seen the last 6 weeks, I see a lot of cohesion in in Europe. Of course, Portugal will always be less affected than Estonia, just geographically. But so far, the Portuguese did not say, we go out of this because you are part of this entire thing. And the EU is first and foremost an economic institution. It was not designed as a military institution, and it cannot be, but it can support all this. And then all the issues we were talking about at the beginning, European defense industry, creating economic conditions under which a defense industry can work efficiently. These are all things the EU does very, very effectively. Changing priorities, for instance, how much climate change or how much climate protection can we still afford, a terribly important issue if we at the same time have to produce things which are not climate friendly. So, huge amount of different of deals you have to make, where it's not a simple yes or no. I'm not sure that this requires a German leadership. What it needs, though, and this is something which the previous government has neglected, close contacts to the big ones in Europe, France and the UK, and close contacts to the medium and smaller ones, Poland, medium, and the smaller ones, the Baltics. This has to do with the fact that Chancellor Scholz was not a foreign policy chancellor. It's just not in his genes. unlike Helmut Kohl was, unlike Angela Merkel was, who always said we have to make sure if we make a deal with the big ones, make sure that the small ones are in the loop, so that they feel to be. I mean, the entire business of leadership is to make your allies feel that you do what they actually want to do.
Yeah. Be stakeholders.
Exactly. And for this, you have to keep them in the loop. And this is something where Scholz personally failed. He neglected the contacts to France. Macron is a difficult person to deal with. He neglected the contacts to the UK, which went through difficult positions. It's not only to blame him, but this is something that Merz is reestablishing immediately now. One of his first, I mean, he traveled to all these countries before the elections to make sure not German leadership, but we are a union, or we are a group of like-minded countries. If you really want to go a little bit far, is we are the West now without the US. Painful to say. And this includes, by the way, not only Europe. This includes Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and whoever feels to be in this group by proving through his action that this, this equality before the law are not stupid ideas, but it's something we are standing for. And that's why the West is still there. This idea, US leadership has gone, now we need another leader. I don't see anyone ready to do, because the other ones don't want to be led. No, the UK doesn't want to be led by France, and France doesn't want to be led by Germany, and vice versa. And the Poles definitely want to be led by France, and so on and so forth. So this entire leadership thing, consultation in good faith, doing what each of them can do best, and we have nuclear powers and non-nuclear powers, will bring us, I think, fairly far.
Karl-Heinz, thank you for joining us again and for sharing your insights on The Focus.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. From Rome, Italy, that was Associate Fellow of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and lecturer at the University Roma III, Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Karl-Heinz Kamp. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Karl-Heinz and connect with him on social media. Now on to questions for the audience. What do you think is Germany's biggest security challenge today? Immigration, Russia, or something else? Should Germany take a more independent role in European defense, or should it continue relying on NATO and the US? Do you believe Europe needs its own nuclear deterrent separate from the US and NATO? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, and we'd also appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them into the comments section and I'll do my best to respond to as many of them as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.